So before I turn it over to Anton and Failene to wrap up, I will give two plugs. One is that stick around for the next session at 1 o'clock in room number 1 will be How Do We Win Real Change? So that will feature NDP, MPP Cher de Novo, Andre Frappier from Quebec Solidaire, and Rich Wyman from the International Socialists. So that should be a spicy discussion. And if you are interested in further reading on these topics today, this book's really great. It's in the book room. It's called Red the Rainbows, Sexuality, Socialism, and LGBT Liberation, Abortion and the Struggle for Reproductive Justice, and Women in Socialism, Race, Class, and Capital by Sharon Smith. These are all in the book room. And because theory is nothing without practice, because we're Marxists, there is a rally on May 8th, a Mothers Day rally for Jillery Massa. She's a member of my union, and she was fired while she was on mat leave. And so we're going to be, a lot of pressure is being put to have her job reinstated or some justice to happen as a result. So if you can make it, that would be fantastic. So it's May 8th at what time is it?
It's at 12 minutes.
12.
Bring all the babies with carriages, so you know.
If we have them.
If you have to borrow them for the day.
Okay, great. So who wants to? Okay, well, I'll turn it over to Anton.
Sure. I was thinking of something you said when you were sales associate. I was thinking while you were saying you never met a salesperson, regardless if they were called a sales associate by their employer, like, yeah, I'm such a stakeholder in this business.
Yes.
I don't really think they think that. Like, but I mean, obviously there are cases where you know, oh, I'm a manager. You manage like one other person and just like. But I think that the larger point is that capitalism can't indefinitely fulfill its promises to the workers. Like, it gets into crisis at some point. You know, like it always eventually falls short. And those are the points when critical ruptures can take place, when struggles emerge, and those are the chances from those struggles that things can emerge. In other words, like the ideology by now may simply become unviable when necessity comes to hammer home the reality of their class position. The only other thing I wanted to talk about was I think about identity politics. I don't really have an answer to the question whether or not. I mean, there are obviously feudal forms of oppression, but it doesn't really what they're asking. Would oppression exist after socialism? No. Anyway, but on the identity politics, Karen talked about how there's a certain kind of Marxism, the one that I was trying to argue against. It was like, let's struggle first, solve the problems of oppression after, blah, blah, blah. We have to accept, I think, that we ourselves grow up in an oppressive society, and we often fail to understand the seriousness of systematic humiliation and victimization, violence as an act of oppressed people, especially if we don't experience that particular kind of oppression. And that has translated to the culture of many Marxist organizations. The Socialist Workers' Party in America tried really, really hard to overcome its own sort of white inertia and actually failed. And we talk about identity politics as emerging from the defeats of the left. One of the reasons for those defeats is the failure of the Marxist left at the time to understand how to engage with oppression systematically. Like, until we take responsibility for that, we're just not going to understand identity politics. But the important point as well is that ideas can change as the struggle forces you to rethink them. Of course, that depends on how the struggle itself develops. What opportunities for rethinking present themselves. But Stokely Carmichael, one of the most important members of Black Panthers, started out with a conception of Black power that's really quite similar to identity politics. But as the logic of the struggle develops, you get more and more of a class kind of understanding of the nature of this, and breaks more and more with certain middle class flags, and develops contacts more and more with Marxist organizations who are not so bad on these questions. Starts to develop a conception of the Black Panthers as a vanguard party of the whole class. Right? I mean, maybe you would not quite put it in such sharp terms, but sort of effectively that seems to have been a trajectory. Right? So the important point, though, is that if he had not been engaging in the struggle in the first place, regardless of whether it was identity politics or whatever, he would not have gotten to the clarified position. Right? So even identity politics, to the extent that it gets people into the struggle, is better than nothing. I think it's okay. Oh. Yeah, sorry, that's
So, yeah, I think I'll just a couple of points. On the question of where profit comes from, because actually it's not possible. I mean, capitalism would not exist without living, breathing human beings because, and if you read Marx, where he talks about where does profit actually come from? It doesn't come from the machinery. It doesn't come, from the assembly line. It actually comes from the human beings that have to act on whatever the technology is to produce the profits for capitalists. So, which is why he argues that the working class actually can be, not that it will be, but it could be potentially the end of capitalism if those people actually realize the power that they have. And I think, there's, the ideology of, the sales associates and the Uber economy, that might sound good to people at the top of society or even to middle class kind of entrepreneurs, but in terms of what it sounds like to the ordinary people who actually end up doing that, I mean, I think what we're seeing is a revolt on a global scale against that sort of bullshit. The $15 an hour minimum wage campaigns that have been waged in the United States and here, and that have actually been successful, which someone was saying like 5 years ago, maybe it was Bernie Sanders who said this, that 7 years ago it would have been unimaginable to believe that you could actually get a $15 an hour minimum wage in New York State, in California, in different places. That's because workers are actually rejecting that notion that somehow they're on an equal footing if they're called an associate, even if they make starvation wages. And I also think in terms of oppression, because often Marxism, or the caricature of Marxism that's put forward, is often that Marxists are only interested in the economy. Marxists are only interested in economic liberation. If you actually look, and I think what Anton is talking about in terms of the 60s, if you look at the distortions of Stalinism and what that meant for politics, but if you actually go back farther than that, to the Russian Revolution, and you look at the way the Bolsheviks organized, and we're talking about a society that was still semi-feudal, they didn't see oppression as, somehow down here, and the economy is up here. If you look at the way they organized, how did they organize? They were opposed to national oppression. Lenin called Russia a prison house of nations. They could not have organized as they did or been victorious if they had not taken the question of national oppression into account. It was an extremely anti-Semitic society where the Tsar used that racism to divide and conquer. They had to take the question of anti-Semitism head on, and it's how you got someone like Trotsky, who was a Jew, who was actually elected as the leader of the Petrograd Soviet. Look at women's oppression. What did they do? They set up women's departments so that women would not be isolated in the home. They tried to set up communal kitchens and laundries to say these are tasks that should not be left to individual women in the house, but these are communal tasks. So they weren't just about, it was not simply a question of saying we want economic liberation. It was we want liberation from oppression. And the only way to get liberation from oppression is to wrest control away from that tiny minority of people who divide us and who at the same time take the profits for themselves. So I don't think that you can separate genuine Marxism from the fight against oppression. The two have to go together, and they can't be successful one without the other.